Got some new folks here. If you're here from the SF Tech Week crowd, raise your hand. Hey, come on, I know we've got a few, right? Awesome. How's it going over there? Good. Well, you've come to the heart of SF and Tech here. It's ground zero here at Stanford campus, so welcome. Yeah, without further ado, we're really privileged to have Suzanne Kelly, who's the CEO, and I guess you started the Cipher, right?
Yeah, 10 years ago.
Built it, and Suzanne, long history with CNN, starting out in Berlin, and then the main headquarters in Atlanta. Those were some pretty exciting years when CNN was kicking off.
Yeah, for sure.
You'll learn a lot more about that with Ernestine. And beyond that, you wrote, what was your book called, Master of War? With Eric Prince? Okay. Anyone heard of Blackwater Eric Prince? Pretty big personality. I know him personally.
Yeah.
Traveled to crazy places with him.
How do you know him?
I was in, my background, it was
okay.
a lot of overlap.
Similar. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, especially when it's trying to privatize the war in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I think I was in Afghanistan at the time. So.
We might have been. I went with him when I was writing the book to Afghanistan.
Okay, maybe so. I did a couple tours there. So, but a lot of interesting time. Try to get a little bit out of her, and actually, I don't want to bust you out too much, but let's just say that some of our three-letter intelligence agencies would have been very fortunate to have her as a senior person in their organization, because she's just that good at building relationships and getting information and telling the truth and making it available. Is that safe? Can I say it that way?
That's so nice. Yeah, thanks.
It's a huge honor to have multiple people ask her or acknowledge her that she would have been a great addition to her organization. But Suzanne, really, really fortunate to have you. Ernestine's got a great set of questions, and our own Eric Volmar is going to give a quick wrap up at the end. But thanks everyone for joining me. Suzanne, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.
Great. Perfect. Well, thank you, Suzanne, for joining us here today. And thank you, Joe, for the intro remarks. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time just on your career as a journalist and writer before starting the Cipher Brief, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the Cipher Brief, and then also just go into views on current trends, and then open it up for audience Q&A as well. So maybe just like pre-Cipher Brief days. So you started your career as a freelance foreign correspondent. You were among the first journalists at a very, tense moment in June 1999. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and specifically, why don't you describe the event and also just what it was like to be on the ground at this particular moment?
Okay, so I think, gosh, this is like memory lane for me, because this is a super long time ago. I'm really, really old. But I think when I started my journalism career, I realized that there was sort of a traditional path to doing things, and then there was the way that was going to get you probably where you wanted to be a lot faster. So instead of doing like the sort of local news, well, I did try to do local news. How many of you guys know who Dan Rather is? It's so funny. Okay, actually more than I thought would. So he followed Walter Cronkite at CBS and was sort of like the most trusted voice in journalism for a long time. I did an internship with him when I was in college at the CBS Evening News. And then I actually went and got my first job in local television, which was like the pathway that people said you had to take to become a journalist. I'm taking a long way to get to this, but I'll get there. And so my first job was as an outdoor weather girl in Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, on an outdoor weather set. And I was like, I don't know anything about weather, and I don't know what to say in front of a camera for 4.5 minutes, all ad lib. Turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened in my career, because it was like an under pressure, you're in an uncomfortable situation, you either do well or you run, and I wasn't gonna run. So that kind of really introduced to me what the path was gonna be like going up through local news, and I didn't wanna do it. Mm-hmm. What I really wanted to do was cover stories overseas. Mm-hmm. I wanted to find ways to explain to people through storytelling why what happened outside of the United States actually mattered and would impact them at a time when it wasn't super popular. Mm-hmm. A lot of the larger news organizations were shutting down their foreign bureaus. They didn't want to pay for it. And I was like, I really just want to get out there. And mostly, I have to admit, it was a little bit selfish, because I just wanted to learn. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to meet people and tell their stories. So fast forward, I decided to take the freelancing route and quit my job, which my boss said I was absolutely crazy. She's like, I'm gonna hold it for you for 6 months because I know you're gonna be back.
We
And
know
I'm like,
you want to be
I'm
back
not
reporting on
coming
weather.
back.
So.
Exactly right. Who can
Yeah.
turn that down? So I quit and I moved overseas and just started trying to freelance and going out to a lot of different organizations that would hire freelancers. So Voice of America I worked for Deutsche Welle, which is like the German version of the BBC. I just started getting work wherever I could do it and covering stories. And then the war in Kosovo breaks out, and I'm like, oh wow, like that sounds like another challenge, really cool. So I talked my way into getting sent down there. It's like, it's a hard career. I feel like today, like I have kids who are at that stage that I was in at this point in my life, and they're like, I'm doing all the right things, I'm waiting for it to happen. And I'm like, it doesn't happen that way, ever. Like it's a constant hustle. It is a constant being told no. It's a constant trying to find your way around, whether you're doing journalism or technology, right? So I just kept pushing. So I got myself down to Kosovo without a support network. I was like, okay, great. I bought my own plane ticket. It was my birthday, and I was on this like old Russian plane that didn't have seat belts, the seats folded forward. They only had vodka to drink on the plane. I'm totally not kidding. And it was like one of the last planes into Skopje in Macedonia before they shut down the airspace. And I get myself in with CNN there, which was great. I'm like, hey, I talked to a lot of people. I'm talking with a lot of the folks at NATO. Like, can I do stuff for you guys? Because like I need to earn some money. I'd like to eat.
Besides vodka.
So exactly. Vodka only goes so far. So they were like, yeah, sure. So I just started meeting people and talking to people. And I think that's why people say, you know, my kids think I work for the CIA, which I swear to God, I've never worked for the CIA. But it's exactly the same skill set. You talk to people, you find trusted sources of information that you believe in because you're staking your reputation as a journalist on your sources. And you know, we just share that information with the world as opposed to turning it into intelligence to brief policymakers. So I find myself in June of 1999, I had rented a car and driven into Kosovo when they finally opened it up to the airport, which at the time was a really contested space. And the Russians wanted control of the airport because they could control the supply chains in and out of Kosovo, and they weren't going to give it to NATO. So Russians had controlled the airport, and June 1999, I had to go in on a rental car with the NPR reporter at the time because I couldn't afford to get it on my own. So we drive into Kosovo through like Sniper Alley, and I'm like driving, and he's like, oh, I'm not a good driver, you have to drive. And I'm like, okay. And we're driving in, and he goes, you know why they call it Sniper Alley? Thinking it was really funny, and I was like, why? And he goes, because they always shoot the driver first. And I was like, okay, I don't like you anymore.
Yeah.
And I just drove faster. But I found myself at the gates. So there are limits to like how far you should push yourselves, probably. I feel like I got right up to that edge, and then I was stepped back. But I found myself at the gates of the airfield at the time, and there was a Russian soldier who was like, you're not coming in. And seeing this young kid who was like probably 19, 20 years old, a little bit younger than I was at the time, who was nervous, who had a weapon, who was under some pressure, was the first time in my life that it wasn't like a storybook anymore. It was like seeing someone face to face and realizing the stress, and they see you as a threat, and understanding in that moment that I needed to take a step back. It was I think that was a defining moment for me in my career. And I never stopped, but it taught me something at a very young age that, you know, there's a balance, which is like drive, but also the time to stop and reflect. So that you can do something maybe more impactful.
Yeah. Did you sense immediately how significant the moment would become, or how did you even think about reporting on the situation and navigating the risks and the logistics?
Yeah, I did. I think it's so easy now for us to watch the news and watch these awful things that are happening in the world and just think it's someone else's problem and turn off the TV and order Uber Eats or whatever it is and go on with your life. I think in that moment, I really realized the risk that people take to tell these stories. And it all of a sudden just hit home for me that this is real. And I felt a deeper responsibility. I wouldn't say that I ever just thought it was fun and a challenge. I always knew there was a weighty responsibility to it, but it definitely changed who I was.
Yeah. So as Joe mentioned, you also spent a significant portion of your career at CNN. Maybe you can share like one or two defining stories from your time there.
Gosh,
I know there's probably
so many.
a lot to pick from.
Okay, so I talked my way into that job, not surprising to anybody. And most people, when they describe me now, just say, I hired her so she'd stop bothering me, which is fine. I'm proud of it. But I was living in Berlin because I'd done a fellowship there and decided I have to be here, quit my local news job, moved to Berlin. And I really wanted to be on CNN. I wanted to like speak in English because I didn't speak German, very practical. But their headquarters were in London, and I was like, don't you guys ever need like backup anchors? Like I've done weekend anchor work and outdoor weather work. Like, I'm qualified to do this. I care about these issues. I know about them. And the guy in London at the time, his name was Tony Maddox. I actually remember him calling me after probably my fourth or fifth like email to him, and just saying, okay, if you promise me you will never email me again, I'm going to give you a job. And I was like, deal. And I ended up working for him for a number of years in various different ways, and just really appreciated the support that I got from him along the way too. But that's, so one of the most embarrassing things, which was also could have been a life-changing moment, I was pregnant with my daughter at the time, and I was about 3 or 4 months pregnant, right when like morning sickness kicks in. And I was a fill-in anchor in a morning show, so you have to be at work in the anchor chair at 4 a.m. And it's like, it's not a big, beautiful studio, it's a closet. And you're the only person in there. And I remember my family's like, are you nervous that you're gonna be live in front of like people in 3 continents? And I'm like, it's literally a closet.
Yeah.
And if you don't think about that, you just do your thing. But I was getting morning sickness, and so I remember like going in between commercial breaks, just being like, oh my gosh, it was right after George Bush Sr. had, I think he was visiting Japan or something, and actually like threw up all over the table. And I was like, I'm gonna have that kind of moment. But I think that was another career defining, like, am I sure I wanna do this?
Yeah, yeah.
But
is there a story you reported on then that changed the view, maybe changed the way you viewed the world?
the world,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it was a Kosovo story. Because you had ethnic cleansing going on. You had neighbors who had, pushed their neighbors out of the country. They were coming back in, and instead of them welcoming them as neighbors, they were burning their houses down so they wouldn't have homes to come back to. And it was a real, it was a wake up for me to what the world was really like, because I didn't have that upbringing. I was a very sort of pro-America, we're the best country. I believed all of that stuff. And I still do, but I'm a little more realistic. It was definitely changed the way I saw the world and the way I saw people fighting about culture and land. And other people I would talk to who were more experienced to me at the time were like, it's always been this way, and it's always going to be this way. And the story doesn't change, just the people. And I was like, oof.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a little depressing, but also very true.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, in addition to being, of course, an investigative journalist, you've also been a storyteller, an author. You authored Master of War. And would love to just ask some questions on that experience in order to bring out your perspectives as a storyteller. So I guess what first compelled you to write the book in the first place? Was there a particular moment that you felt that Erik Prince and Blackwater needed its own book?
Yes. It was when the images of 4 Americans were hanging from a bridge in Fallujah. And it was all over the television screen. And there were bodies hanging from the bridge. It was horrific to see. And then you hear that they're Americans, but the U.S. military isn't involved in operations there. What are they doing there? Who are they? These are Americans with families. What is this mission that they're on? And it opened the world of contractors to me. And the fact that these contractors had been used, all throughout history. I mean, Erik Prince will tell you, since the country started. And they've always supported, but who were these guys and what were they doing? They're actually escorting kitchen equipment. So they're doing logistics work in Iraq. And this is how their story ended. And it just really, to me, I think when you want to be a journalist and you want to tell people stories, that was incredibly compelling. And I thought, okay, so I started talking to people and asking questions, which I do. And then the more questions I asked, the less I was satisfied with the answers. So a lot of times people would say, well, the US military doesn't want to do this, so they contract it out to these private companies. And I'm like, well, what's the accountability on the private companies? Well, it's a little bit fuzzy. I'm like, what does a little bit fuzzy mean? So it kind of opened up this whole world to me.
Yeah.
And I started trying to find people in the organization who I knew and I could talk to get an introduction to Erik Prince and to ask, I would like to tell a story.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how did you even think about getting access to sources, like really credible information when writing the book? And yeah.
That's such a great story. Such a great question for so many reasons, and it'll probably come back later in our conversation. But it was really important to me to talk to people who actually knew the answers and weren't speculating. Most of what you see on television today are people speculating about something. They're not people who were there. They're not people who saw it, felt it, touched it, lived it. They're people who maybe came from that world 20 years ago, but they have the 3 letters in their title, but they don't actually know. I really wanted to talk to people who were there, so I started finding them. People from the State Department, Ambassador Patrick Kennedy. I ended up interviewing more than 100 people for that book who were actually there, who had had some sort of relationship to how the contracting phenomenon really took off, what the need was. I wanted multiple perspectives on it, and that's what I was lucky enough to end up getting.
Yeah, yeah. I guess even just like looking back, what impact do you think the book had on more of the national conversation around private military contractors? Yeah.
Yeah. It was really interesting because when people would ask me a lot, like after the book was published, well, are you pro-contractors or anti-contractors? Like everyone wants to label you and make it really neat and interesting. I was like, well, I actually think that without contractors, now that I understand how the world works, America would not be America. That is absolutely true. Like it is a critical function in US national security to have that kind of support that you can flex. It's also really important, as we saw with what happened to Blackwater, that there are clear standards of accountability for different things. And I think that was a real lesson for me. And then of course, I had incredible access to Erik Prince, which he wasn't necessarily a very trusting person and doesn't really like the media very much. So I felt like there was an added responsibility to get it right. But that also meant sometimes reporting things that he didn't like. But I'm proud of the book.
Yeah.
He wrote a book himself a few years later and actually quoted many things from my book. So I thought, okay, like I think it tells an important story about who we are as a country that not a lot of people really focused on. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. I read some of the reviews of the book and just a lot of folks praising it for being very fact-based and not sensational. So maybe we could talk about Cipher Brief Days and what inspires you to start Cipher Brief. Did you feel like there was a gap in national security reporting that wasn't being filled?
Yes. I really, I guess I'll kind of back into this a little bit, but I remember going on the air live one night, and I won't mention like which anchor's show it was for. But I remember going on the air, and I've been reporting a story all day long. I've been like going and talking to what I thought were very credible sources who knew what the facts were. And it was a live shot. And for a live shot in an evening show, you have about maybe 4 minutes max if you're lucky. And the first question out of the gate wasn't, tell us what you're reporting is like indicating like, what do you think is happening here? It was, I saw this blog today, and the person on the blog wrote this. What about that? And so I ended up getting in like reaction mode to like a blog from a person who was an influencer, but not an expert. And it ended up eating up like most of the 4 minutes I was gonna get to tell that story that night. And I just thought, I think there's a better way to do this. So I started talking to my sources at the time, the people I had trusted who knew me in national security and had worked with me over the years. And I said, if I'm crazy enough, because I was getting older and I was like, I only have so much time to do this. If I'm crazy enough to quit my job and to go and launch a new company where all we do is interview experts, people who actually have different perspectives but know these issues better, and we take it more seriously, would you at least be a source for me? And all of them said yes. And we have more than 200 experts in our roster now, which is almost unheard of, because when I started covering the CIA as an intelligence correspondent, they wouldn't talk to anybody they would not talk to anyone. And then they started dripping out folks, and they were all of these like 50 plus white guys who were cool and had stories. And I was like, well, where are like some of the other stories, right? Where are the women? The women would never talk. And I'm like, why won't they talk? And so we started this little series at CNN. I was like, let's do women in intelligence and profile these women and talk about what they do. And now, like, fast forward like 10 years later, I think we host an event that we do now as an event as well in Georgia, which has been described as the largest gathering of former intelligence officers anywhere, and talk about like world events. So I feel like even though it's a media organization, the Cipher Brief has sort of touched the national security community in different ways other than just telling stories. But I think they've encouraged people to come out and share more. And I feel like that's been an important part of bringing transparency to what the IC does. It's not just the movies where they're either the really good guys or the really bad guys. It's like there's a reality in there somewhere.
Yeah.
That's what we try to.
Yeah. What were some of the challenges in launching Cipher Brief? Was it recruiting this 200 plus expert network? Was it funding? Was it establishing credibility, or?
The recruitment was the easy part, actually. It feels like that would be the hardest, but funding is really hard. I mean, I was a journalist. Like, I didn't even understand like the lexicon. I didn't know what terms to use to go and raise money. And I, again, just started asking a lot of folks. And Gilman Louie, who I'm sure you know, was one of, the early on introduction to Gilman. And I was like, I don't understand the VC thing. I still don't understand it. I'm like, wait a minute. You ask people for a whole lot of money and to trust you, and then you go and you invest in a lot of things, and most of them are going to fail. And I'm like, okay, like that makes no sense to me. But I had to kind of learn to navigate that world. And so I was lucky enough to pull together, I think, a group of investors who, some of them are angel investors, and then VC, and to back this crazy idea of actually building a media company that really actually cared about what the people who were being interviewed said. Because now if you fast forward to today and you think about how much we all frame our thinking of the world based on what we saw on television or whatever feed we follow, it's really important. I mean, we're deciding who we vote for. We're deciding how we feel about a conflict, if we support this or not. We're deciding, like we're being educated on misinformation and disinformation, which is flooding the zone. So I feel like more than ever, it's really important to do that, but I also feel discouraged because I feel like more than ever, it's harder. It's much harder to do that.
In light of all that, like, how has Cipher Brief also evolved since its founding, and what's kind of like changed or even stayed the same?
Oh my gosh, I've learned so much. I joke sometimes. I say I'll write a book someday as like the CEO you've never heard of, and the book is going to be like a comedy, like a startup, how to do a startup in media, which is like probably the worst possible area to like start up a company in, and it hasn't changed. I think it's I've learned a lot. Like I said, there are things I would do differently, but there are things I wouldn't change at all to do it again. I feel like as we look at kind of the horizon, like for our company, and no company is going to be around forever, but I really hope that our legacy is that we sparked a change in transparency and in actually getting back to like sources, and sources matter. And I don't know if we will, but I hope so.
So maybe let's just take a step back and just like from the standpoint of, I think if you think about the balance of reporting on sensitive security issues without compromising national security, like in your career from CNN to Cipher Brief, like where have you felt this sort of tension between informing the public and protecting national security?
This isn't talked about a lot, but if you're kind of like a news junkie, you probably run across these stories where journalists will get information about ongoing operations. And that's like touchy because people are deployed. If you report on a program that's happening at that time, there's a very real possibility that the people who are deployed or the assets that some intelligence officer may have developed will be identified and killed. It's super simple. I don't think they sit at offices in countries, our adversaries, and decide, oh, should we kill them? Maybe they're not. Maybe they're nice. No, they just kill them.
Yeah.
I think when we have been approached, and I say we, like when I was at the network, we would always you always followed like a really good ethical journalism protocol, which seems out the window today. But we would go to the agencies and we would say, this is information we have, is this true or not? Because you always want to get a statement. And there would be, cases, it doesn't happen a lot, but it happens with everybody, the New York Times, everyone, where they would say, we need you not to report this for a period of time. And they usually define what that period of time is. And it's an opportunity for them to, they don't really have a choice. They have to kind of like close up that operation. There are a lot of things that can happen as a result of that, in terms of like our access to intelligence. So there's a very interesting balance.
Yeah.
And there's always been sort of a love-hate relationship, I think, between the two communities because of that.
Yeah. Do you feel like the protocol's changed these days?
It depends on if we're talking about journalists or influencers, because they're very different.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tell who's who anymore in this space. They all blend together. You have social media influencers now who I'm pretty sure don't follow the same ethics that they teach you in journalism school in social media school, right? It doesn't exist. I think there's a me culture. If I can get a story in someone, if I can get more clicks, if I can get more followers, if I can get more likes, I'm going to do it. And I think that's very different from old school journalism, which there's much more of a sense of responsibility about, am I getting this right before I do it?
Yeah.
So I worry a lot about that.
Yeah. How do you handle criticism, especially when reporting on topics that might spark political or institutional pushback?
I love it because then you've hit a nerve. I think part of that is just my personal philosophy of we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. If you make a mistake, own it. Apologize for it, fix it. If if it's not a mistake, you've just hit a nerve because something needs to be talked about, a story needs to be told, people need to understand what's going on. That can come across as criticism, but actually I think it's fantastic. I think those are the things that change the world one small piece at a time. When you've hit a nerve on something that hasn't been told. People told me when we started the Cipher brief, there's no incentive for intelligence officers or military officers to talk about what they're doing. And I'm like, oh, are you talking to them? Do you understand the impact and that their role has in their lives and on the bigger picture? And it just didn't prove that their theory was right. But I would have never known if I wasn't at least willing to push through the criticism.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk about the topic just around, I think some critics maybe argue that governments overclassify information, while others warn that too much transparency also endangers lives. Where do you stand on that balance in terms of holding security institutions accountable without undermining ongoing
I think both are
operations?
true.
Yeah.
I think both are true. I think, I don't have access to classified information. I've never gotten a security clearance because if I did, and I was invited to at one point, but I would have had to gone through a pre-review process before I could publish anything, and I was not willing to give that up. But the people who do have access to classified information tell me repeatedly that things are classified to a ridiculous degree. I did a story on this at CNN once because I thought the classification process was so interesting. I'm like, who designates it anyway? And how is it reviewed? And so I can't remember who it was who was speaking at the time. It might have been John Brennan, was talking about the agency's drone program and how they were using drones. And this would have been 12, 13 years ago. And I thought, that's a classified program. They're not actually supposed to talk about that. And so I went through this whole, I did a whole story on what makes something classified. And once it's reported, is it then not classified anymore? And I was talking to lawyers and they were like, well, we don't actually know either. This is a really gray area. And I'm like, whoa, this whole classification thing's a mess. And that's proven to be true still. I think that there are definitely aspects of things being overclassified that keep information from the public that really doesn't need to be kept from the public. But again, we're all human and someone's got to make those decisions.
You mentioned earlier, just very briefly, on the topic of disinformation
Yeah.
and like how do you ensure credibility and trust in this kind of day and age with all of that going on?
I think the very first thing has to be admitting when you're wrong. Saying, whoa, made a mistake. Here are all the details. Here's how I made the mistake, and move forward. I think we're living in this culture now of perfection and judgment, and people will decide very quickly whether they believe you or not, and you have like a split second. And I think it's difficult for someone like me who spends a lot of time building up relationships and trust. And you might not like what I write about in this story after I interview you, but it's at least going to be true. You'll at least hopefully respect that it's bringing out truth. But I don't know that we live in that world anymore. That worries me.
Yeah.
Do you feel that
Yeah.
way? Do you feel
Yeah.
like it's sort of like quick judgment?
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. I think there's that, but also just, especially with these digital platforms
Yeah.
emerging and that being a lot different from when you first started your
Yes.
career, information spreads a lot faster. But also, if I think about sensitive information also spreading a lot faster than before, like curious kind of what your thoughts are on that as well, given that Cipher Brief is 100% digital. Yeah.
Yeah. Things are moving so fast. I don't think you're putting that genie back in the bottle ever.
Yeah.
I really don't. So,
Yeah.
and I think it's almost like everyone, the big debate in AI, right, is like, oh, wait, the technology is moving so fast that we don't know how to build in the safeguards we need for AI, and everybody is talking about it. It's kind of the same thing with information. The technology has accelerated it so quickly that we haven't stopped to say, should we build in some ethics? Should we build in some basics? What you do, what you don't do? I just think, technology is really in control. We're all along for the ride at this point.
It's more
But-
just having to adapt to it rather than
Have
fight
to
it.
adapt
Yeah.
to it. You're not going to fight it.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe final question for me before we open up to audience Q&A is, for any aspiring journalists in the room, aspiring journalists who are interested in reporting on national security, what advice do you have?
Oh my gosh, don't give up. Definitely don't give up. Hopefully, the reason why you want to get in it is based on your own values and how you see the world and wanting to share information. I remember going all the way back to Dan Rather. I remember I asked him the very same question when I was a 20-something intern. And he said, I give one piece of advice to everyone who asks me that question, because you can imagine how many thousands of people ask it. And he said, you should quit and you should go do something else, because it's a horribly difficult career. And I was like, well, people still ask you for advice? That's terrible. And he said, no, it's actually excellent, because the people who don't quit, even after being given that advice, are the people who are going to succeed. And so I think people tease me all the time about I don't ever take no for an answer, not to an annoying degree, but a respectable degree. But I think I would give that exact same advice today. I would say if it's something that you truly believe in, it doesn't matter if it's journalism or anything else, you're going to get a lot of no's and a lot of people who tell you can't do it. I think it's more just a mental game. And pushing through that and believing in yourself is sometimes really hard, but it's the most important thing.
Yeah, yeah. Suzanne, thanks again for joining us here today.
Suzanne, it's been such a privilege to have you here. I mean, this is the first time I've been able to hear from you and truly inspired. And some of the wrap-up comments I would say are how much Suzanne belongs at Stanford. Let me explain why. What you just explained is you truly are an entrepreneur, and that you created something in a space that no one expected. And yet, you were able to do it because you had the tenacity, the grit, the vision, and you were able to gather resources together. It's incredible to see what you build. I'll offer just a few things in recap of stories that we heard that I found very inspiring. When you were in Kosovo, you talked about how you realized it's not someone else's problems, and that changed who you are. When you were trying to get into CNN, you said that they eventually gave up and said, hire her so she would stop bothering me. And that's another entrepreneurial thing, is just that tenacity and that drive to do that. And I'm guessing that's a little bit of an exaggeration. Of course, there were many
Not
reasons.
much.
Not much? Well, there it goes. And maybe that's to your credit about the persistence. When you talked about working through reporting on information that it wasn't clear what was safe to report or not, doing the right thing no matter what. And it makes me stop and think for all of us that doing the right thing is really, it sounds like a platitude until it's not, and you're put in these situations that are seemingly impossible. You have to have decided what type of person and who you're going to be before then. And it's clear that you spend a lot of time thinking about your values and who you should be. Just a few other things that is kind of wrap up comments as we all think about engaging in public service in one form or another. As I heard your story, it reminded me that none of us really know our gifts until we start trying to do something that's very, very hard. We can often surprise ourselves, and perhaps an invitation to all of our students here. Think about some of the gifts that you know about yourself, but what are some things that you have a hunch that you might be good at, or that you might have as a superpower? When you start to put those towards things that really matter, I think you're going to surprise yourselves. And Suzanne, you're just such an amazing example of doing that. Truly inspired by that. I'll offer one last piece of wrap-up that is so fitting for this course. It's to believe in what you're doing. And when you believe in what you're doing, you can make a world of difference. And that invitation that Suzanne gave to all of us, I think the whole teaching team, Joe, Ernestine, me, would extend to everyone, is give it a lot of thought to engage in public service. If you do it and put something bigger than yourself above your own interests at the moment, there's a transformative process that happens for all of us. And Suzanne, we're so grateful that you would take the time to come here to Stanford to be with us and to share. We hope you come back. And we'll wrap up there with some time for students to come maybe talk to you a little bit more.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you,
Thank
Suzanne.
you. Thank you, guys.